Hello and welcome to EDH Rec's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDH Rec and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. This week, I hope you're caught up on your Batman lore because we're playing Harvey Two-Face's favorite commanders. Okaun and Zndrsplt, the red-blue coin-flipping battle bond pair, leaders of the heads I win, tails you lose secret lair. Whenever you move to combat, each of them flips coins until you lose a flip, and anytime anyone wins a coin flip, Zndrsplt draws you cards while Okaun doubles his own power. Their EDH Rec page is both predictable and unpredictable. Like, we expect to see a bunch of coin-flipping cards, but what we don't know is what's going to happen whenever we cast any one of them. We might draw cards and make our Cyclops bigger, or things might totally blow up in our face. Let's get going! We'll grab their average deck list from the average deck feature and import it to the Architect deck building website. As always in this series, any swaps made to the deck must either keep the total price cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the list. I'll admit right off the bat that this was a challenging deck upgrade to do. I mean, the whole point of this deck is to embrace the chaos a little bit, right? In so many ways, the thing that makes this deck appealing in the first place is that it's a little bit wild and weird. So when upgrading cards, it's hard to cut a card for being, quote, bad, because the deck isn't here just to play objectively powerful cards. It's here to be a little bit zany. Still, we have to draw the line somewhere, and the job of this series is to up the average and make things run a little more smoothly. And frankly, like it or not, there are a number of ways that this deck really needs to improve. For this deck to actually pull off any of those wild swingy plays, it needs to be able to function in the first place. So my swaps here are all in service to that end. Let's make this coin flipping deck have an easier time actually getting to the point where we can do all that wacky stuff. Before we begin though, let's get to know the deck's core cards. The first and most obvious place to start is the card Crux Thumb, which gives us 2 bites at the apple every time we flip a coin. This is so integral to the deck that the average list contains a large number of clever tutors to help us locate it. Heck, some of our lands even help recover it if it gets destroyed. With the Crux Thumb in play, our engine kicks into overdrive, taking us from an uncertain strategy to an unstoppable powerhouse. And, of course, there are some extremely fun coin flip cards all on their own. Stitch in Time to get an extra turn, Chance Encounter potentially winning the game, Usury drawing cards. There are a lot of fun flip effects and interesting payoffs for whenever we win a coin toss, and a lot of interesting enablers to make those things happen more often. Since one of our commanders draws cards whenever we win coin flips, infinite hand size and draw payoffs take up a small chunk of the deck, since we could potentially go on a tear winning a huge number of flips if we have that Crux Thumb in play. One of the best coin flippers in the deck is easily Frenetic Efreet. It turns out we can activate this ability multiple times in a row, and they'll each resolve individually regardless of whether the Efreet is still in play. So if we activate it like 10 times or 50, we can bank a bazillion coin flips in a row and totally brute force the odds. Speaking of brute force, I think it's fair to say that the primary focus of this deck is Okaun. Winning 3 flips is all he needs to become lethal. He doubles from 3 to 6, then 6 to 12, and then 12 to 24, making commander damage a huge part of our win condition. This is why so much of the deck is devoted to making him hard to block. If he gets 4 coin flip wins, then he goes from 3 power to 48 power, which is why we also see a high number of fling and other such damage effects in the deck too. Okaun is a ticking time bomb. With just a few flips, he will easily crush our enemies, so all we need to do is set the stage for him to pump up to extraordinary proportions. Zndrsplt will help us find the fuel we need, but our actual win condition is extremely centered upon Okaun's mega pump. Okay, now let's get to the upgrades. I have 3 sections of swaps to make, and they're pretty tricky. First, non-boson role filling. Second, flipping out. And third, mana matters. Let's get to it. This is definitely the most important part of the video, and that's why I had to put this as the first section, because we need to be just very, very clear about what this deck does do and what it doesn't. The very first swap to make to this deck ASAP is to cut these cards immediately, yeet them out of the deck list. Two-Headed Giant and Mana Clash do not work in this deck. Read them carefully. These cards care about whether a coin flip ends up heads or tails. Now read the commanders. They only care when you win a coin flip. That's not the same thing. If the coin comes up heads, that doesn't mean you won the flip, it just means the coin came up heads. That's not winning a coin flip, so we don't get any benefit from our commanders when we cast either of these cards. Mana Clash doesn't do squat for Okaun or Zndrsplt, and neither does the Giant. Get them out of the deck immediately. Next, I'm honing in on a card that I don't fully understand why it's in the deck in the first place, and that's Wand of Wonder. I like this card a lot, actually. It's very fun. And if you're in the mood for a little bit of chaos, that's cool, and that's certainly reason to run it, but I don't think it's a strong card in this here deck. So I'd like to make room for more and better coin flip cards instead of a dice rolling card. The chaotic theme is pretty cool, but we need the card space. There are also a few coin flip cards whose timing works out just extraordinarily poorly for our commanders. I'll start with Creepy Doll. Cute card, it flips coins, but only when it deals damage to another creature. This doesn't fit our play patterns at all, because it's purely a defensive card. In other words, it maybe helps Zndrsplt draw a card sometimes, but it's way inconsistent, and it doesn't do anything for Okaun, whose coin flip bonuses matter most on our own turn to power up for a big combat step. Even if this card sometimes flips a coin, it doesn't do it when and how we need it. I'll tackle the next two at the same time, Fighting Chance and Tide of War. Tide of War is especially egregious, because if we lose the flip, we could lose our commander, and that's a big gamble for 6 mana. Like, we have a Mog Assassin in the deck, which also plays a risky game, right? But theoretically, if we're getting Kruk's Thumb into play ASAP, the risk will be a whole lot less. So in that way, I understand the Mog Assassin because the benefit that we get is pretty huge. But that's my other problem with Fighting Chance and with Tide of War. Even when we manipulate the odds, these cards only have effects when things block. And that is pretty rare. Now, I might be off my rocker here, but if our opponents can easily chump block our power doubling commander, we already weren't going to attack with it. So much of this deck is devoted to making sure that our opponents can't just chump block. If our plan is actually working, then Fighting Chance and Tide of War won't have any chance to work at all, because the whole point of our deck is that Okaun will get huge and won't be blocked. There's nuance here, obviously, but in general, it does not surprise me one bit that as Okaun and Zndrsplt players begin to tune up and optimize their decks, these cards fall down in the deck data very, very fast, because their timing requires a play pattern that our deck actively seeks to avoid. Speaking of play patterns though, let's finally get around to our first swaps into the deck. Mostly what I want to do here is add redundancy to the list. We have a couple of cards that help make our giant Cyclops lethal, but I genuinely think we need some more of them, because that's just how important they are. Okaun can't just be big, he needs a way to push damage through. We'll get to some of the most interesting coin flippy cards to add in section 2, but for now we're filling some holes with a bit more consistency to grease the wheels. Shadow Rift, for instance, will give us another unblockability cantrip for a very lethal Cyclops smash. The more, the merrier. In addition to that, I want more flings. We have a couple over-the-top damage effects already, but if combat is not an option for us, or if we've already taken down one opponent with damage this turn and we want to slam dunk someone else, which is a pretty common play pattern for us actually, then redundancy is again the name of the game. So Kazul's Fury and Thud join the party. If our game plan gets underway, it is not hard for us to end up with a 40 or even 90 power Okaun, and these cards will absolutely clinch us a KO for super cheap. The last role filler hole to fill is a nifty number I like called Footfall Crater. Tap the enchanted land to give a creature haste and trample. Yes, please. In the later game, it won't be unusual for us to cast Okaun and then for him to instantly pop up to like 40 power because of our Kruk's Thumb shenanigans. What he needs most in that moment is to be instantly lethal, hence all of the flings in our deck. But we can also just speed him up and trample him over even the thickest board of tokens. And if we don't need this exact card, it even cycles itself. Trample Haste is just such a good combination for a commander that routinely doubles its power multiple times a turn. Okay, a big section 1, but we're really only getting started. Things get even rougher in section 2. If I may be a little bit brutal, there are a lot of cards in this deck that are only here because they happen to be the most obvious cards that say flip a coin on them. That doesn't mean that they're the best cards or even the best coin flipping cards for this deck strategy. In this section, I'm going to hone in on some total clunkers. These cards may flip coins, but that doesn't make them good for the deck. I'll start with Cricket Scales. This is 8 total mana before it does anything, and it has the chance to kill our own commander. Not to spoil the budget honorable mentions at the end of this video, but it could cost us just 1 mana to flip a coin. Like, 8 total mana to flip 1 coin and potentially lose our commander is ridiculous. I don't care that it's repeatable, it just doesn't help us the way that we deserve. Also on the subject of bad timing is, unfortunately, Boompile. Hilarious card, not great for us though. If we win the flip, we destroy everything. And Zndrsplt might draw us a card for that, but we're probably not activating this if our commander's in play, right? We don't want to use board wipes when we have good stuff in play, and since this would kill our Krark's Thumb and our Mana Rocks, I'm especially cagey about it. Plus, remember, we can't respond to the result of this coin flip. Once the effect starts to resolve and we go to flip the coin, if we win the flip, everything gets destroyed as part of the resolution of this effect. So we can't even fling Okaun in response to a winning flip. We have some board wipes in the deck already, and this card is thematic, but the timing is just not suitable for us. The times that we want to board wipe are because we're way behind, and if we're way behind, we don't want an inconsistent board wipe in that moment. We want something that will reliably get us back into the game. And I don't care for a board wipe that would also destroy our MVPs like Krark's Thumb as it's going down. Similarly is Skyclaw Thrash. 5 mana to get a coin flip when it attacks. Not the worst thing I've ever heard, but again, I think we can do better. Actually, I know we can. Next one is a toughie though, Ral Zarek. I feel pretty bad about pulling this guy. I don't think his +1 ability is entirely useless, but he's really here for the ultimate, right? And I simply don't think it's useful to judge a Planeswalker by hoping we get to the ultimate ability. This is a very exciting card if you can pull it off. And maybe you have. If we're here to up the average though, I feel it's my duty to be frank about a simple truth of multiplayer games and acknowledge how hard it is to get to a Planeswalker's ultimate ability, especially when your deck is not built around Planeswalkers. Oh, also on the awkward timing train are 2 creatures that we find in this deck as well, the Kaboomist and Chaotic Ooze. I don't hate these, but they do underwhelm. They are upkeep triggers, so Okaun or Zndrsplt have to survive a turn rotation to see either of them happen. The Kaboomist could blow itself up every turn, so it's not a very good early drop, and the Ooze is very vanilla. Neither of these are great on their own, is what I'm saying. The thing that pushes them over the edge for me, though, is the fact that they are creatures. We have other enchantment upkeep flippers that I don't mind, because those are harder to destroy, so the chance of them sticking around for a long time is pretty high. Ooze and Kaboomist are both underwhelming and fragile, so that is my contention with them. Oh, and lastly, I'm cutting Brainstorm. The deck doesn't have enough shuffle effects to really justify it. We'll probably just end up Brainstorm locking ourselves, so it's just not a fantastic cantrip. If you love Brainstorm though, the next card that I'd potentially look at cutting is Mirror March. I'm keeping Mirror March in the deck, to be clear, because just playing one creature could net us many coin flips. But it is definitely important to note that we have very few creatures in the deck, and a ton of them are legendary, so we don't actually get the material benefits of this enchantment very much. What we do get is the potential for a bunch of coin flips in a row, though, and I do think that is worth it, personally. So I'm on team Cut the Brainstorm instead. But be critical of both of these. Pay attention to the math in your own deck, you know? March has big potential, but Brainstorm looks to me like it will Brainstorm lock us more often than not. So, okay, that's a lot of waffle, but what am I adding in, then? Well, I have 3 very simple coin flip cards to begin. Orcish Captain, Viashino Sandswimmer, and a Mutalith card from the Warhammer set. The Mutalith is 6 mana for 3 coin flips. Not a horrible rate. Not great, but not bad. The Captain is simple, 1 mana to flip a coin. With the Krark's Thumb in play, we have a hugely increased potential to get multiple positive flips in a row. Now, notably, the Orcish Captain's ability requires a target for it to resolve at all, so we can't bank multiple of these effects in a row like we could with the Frenetic Efreet. The coin flips won't resolve if the Captain happens to pick itself off and we end up with no orcs in play. However, I still think it's worth it to potentially only spend 1 mana at a time to get multiple flips in a row. Then there's the Sandswimmer, and this one does not care whether it's in play when those abilities start to resolve. So much like the Frenetic Efreet, we can pay to activate that ability a ton of times in a row before finally letting them resolve, giving us a ton of coin flips in a row to benefit from. An eclectic mix here, but compared to a lot of the other cards that used to be in this deck, these cards have better actual synergy with our deck, rather than non-bows. And they could give us multiple flips with convenient timing to our commander strategy, so I like them so much better. However, the most important coin flipping cards that I'm going to add in don't actually say the words flip a coin on them at all. I couldn't help but notice this here Spark Double in the average deck list, which is a fantastic way to not only get more coin flip payoffs, but also to get more triggered abilities from our commanders themselves. Both Zndrsplt and Okaun flip coins whenever we move to combat, so let's get more copies of all of that. If we're already playing a Spark Double, we should also consider Irenicus's Vile Duplication, which makes a non-legendary copy of one of our creatures and that token also has evasion. And that's not all. These commanders also love extra combat spells. Every time we move to combat, we flip coins? Cool, let's get more combats then. Who needs an 8 mana Crooked Scales effect to flip 1 coin when we could pay 4 mana and smack our enemies multiple times and flip more coins while we're at it? We don't need to seek out cards that explicitly say to flip a coin. What we need to be is just a little clever and we will totally demolish. Okay, that is section 2, so now we have a very brief section 3. Let's quickly discuss some mana matters. Listen, we've had to cut way more cards than I wanted to cut for this video, but that's because we have to fix an enormous problem with the average deck list. Seriously, I did not want to have to cut that many cards. Some of those were really heart-wrenching, but that's what happens when a deck that has 2 commanders that are both 5 mana comes in with only 34 lands in the average deck list. This deck desperately needs more mana resources. 34 lands is just so low. I know Zndrsplt can potentially draw a lot of cards, but we have 2 commanders and they are both 5 mana. 2 of them! We actually have to cast these in the first place for our strategy to do anything. I am adding in some more mana. I'm getting another bounce land, a myriad landscape, and my personal favorite, access tunnel. The first 2 will help us with land drops and mana consistency, while the latter will act as another copy of Rogue's Passage. We can activate access tunnel on Okaun before combat begins, while he still has 3 power, and that will make him unblockable for the whole turn. Then when we move to combat or start flipping other coins, Okaun will get huge afterwards, but he'll still already be unblockable. This is fantastic utility. Alright, here's the real wrench though. I'm pulling kind of a sly trick in this video, and I'm using the mana base to do it. I'm taking out one of the expensive dual lands here. You may have noticed that some of the cards I added earlier are like $3 or $4, and the only way to stay cost neutral is to therefore cut something kind of expensive. I try not to do this particular move too often in these videos because it does feel a little bit weird. Like, I'm not cutting this land because it's bad, I'm only cutting it to subsidize the cost of the other cards that I wanted to include. That feels a little weird, I know, but at the end of the day, I figure it's still valuable for me to say that one dual land is not nearly as impactful for us as all of the other cards that we've added. So that's the lesson I wanted to impart, and that's how we're able to afford nice upgrades in this list. Ignore a single land and get a bunch of bonkers cool cards instead. That is worth it to me, and I hope you agree. I'm going to replace that land with a Teleria West, by the way. A land that can tutor for Rogue's Passage or our Artifact Reviver lands. There's a lot of utility in the mana base of this deck, so I think these options serve us way better than a single $15 dual land. That's actually it for the swaps, so let's quickly cover some honorable mentions before we go, starting with budget. If you want to build this deck a little bit cheaper, then I highly suggest looking into cards like these. There are some very cheap one-off spells like Winter Sky to help you flip an extra coin here and there, and that could be the difference between getting Okaun's lethal commander damage or not. Also, since we have 2 commanders, backgrounds are way good. Candlekeep Sage greases a lot of wheels when you have a partner deck. How about the inverse? What if you're building the deck on a higher budget? Well, there are some very obvious cards to mention first, especially the Ikoria free spells, but I definitely have to shout out the Mana Crypt too. All on its own, it's more than like 70% of the cost of this deck in its current state, so like no one's obligated to go get this really expensive card, but it is a mana rock that also flips coins. It's very on theme for us. And if you're playing on a higher budget, spruce up the lands. I only cut one of those lands earlier to subsidize the cost of some other cards, but if you're going lavish with the deck, there are several cool land upgrades that you could look into. And finally, since this deck has 2 commanders, I also just want to shout out the card Fury Storm. I just love this card so flipping much with 2 commanders, and it seems especially funny to cast this card on any of our coin flipping spells, especially the extra turn one. Just some food for thought. Okie doke, that should officially do it. Here we have our final Okaun and Zndrsplt list. You can find a link to it down in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you enjoyed flipping out with Okaun and Zndrsplt, and if you have any other recommendations that you would like to make for your fellow coin flip players, make sure you leave those suggestions down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.